Good evening and welcome to this evening's event. It's great to have you with us, whether you are here in person or watching us online. We hope this will be a really interesting and lively conversation, trying to think about the lessons from history about our digital future. My name is Julian Huppert. My day job is running a centre at Jesus College in Cambridge, getting people to think and talk about interesting things. I'm actually also a recovering politician as well, so quite used to talking about things whether or not I know about them. But fortunately, we have a fantastic panel who really do know what we're going to be talking about. Now, before we get started, we are, of course, recording this. For those of you in the room, there are no planned fire alarms, but if there is one, please do go out through the doors over there and let the staff show you where to go. I'm afraid if you are watching online, I have no idea what you do in case of a fire. You'll have to look after yourselves for that. We're really grateful to the Cambridge Festival and the University of Cambridge for hosting us here in this wonderful Babbage Lecture Theatre. It's been renovated since I remember being an undergrad sitting somewhere near the back over there, listening to some wonderful people, Ron Lasky, David Summers and many others. I see a few nods who've heard the songs. And it's wonderful to be back here now. And it's really great to work with the Bennett Institute of Public Policy. It's a really amazing place which I've seen develop into one of the country's leading centres for public policy. Remarkably, it's only, I think, 4 years old. And in some ways, it's quite astonishing that the university didn't have a proper centre for public policy until so recently. It's doing really good research and really good impact. You don't have to do one or the other. So there's a whole lot of collaborations, cross-disciplinary academic research, and it's working on some of the really big issues. So things like net zero, UN Sustainability Development Goals, what you do about widening regional inequalities, and I've participated in some events about levelling up here, governance of the state, and of course, our subject for tonight, digital technology. And so we're not going to ask the panel to talk about all of those things now, we'll just focus on digital technology. But we know that that's having a huge effect on everything we do, whether we talk about smartphones, social media, AI, 5G, virtual reality, smart homes, the things that maybe are coming up in the future. I'll say metaverse before anyone else does. It's changing how we live our lives, how we work, how we play, and the boundaries between all of those. There's huge opportunities, huge positives that can come for improving our lives, tackling some of our biggest challenges, climate change, coronavirus, conflict, poverty, all of that. But there's also harms. How do we get the benefits and avoid any of the harms? Governments are trying to deal with this, we'll discuss whether they're successful or not, but how do you balance the individual risks, the collective risks, the benefits, and distribute the consequences, economic, political, and so forth, more fairly? So that's our topic. And rather than just speculate about the future without looking backwards, we're going to take the past as our key to think about the future, using history to actually try and predict maybe what will happen and what to look out for. So we have a star team of panellists. I'm going to introduce them in a second. But just to say, we're going to hear from each of them for what's been described as a mini keynote. So it's 5 minutes, and I will be quite brutal and strict, and I will be, increasingly rude as we get near to the 5 minutes. But we're also going to have lots of questions, because you in the audience here and online, I'm sure, have much better questions than I have to ask the panel. So please do put your hand up and wait for the mics if you're here. If you're online, have a look at the Q&A, and I will try and bring those questions in. You can ask questions anonymously if you like, or you can have your name attached to it. I guess the same is true here, but we can see you here. So our wonderful panel are really going to pick up from different perspectives with different starting points. So we're going to start nearest me and then go away. So we'll start with Claire Melamed, who is an affiliated researcher at the Bennett Institute and CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, trying to bring together governments, private sector and civil society to use data and data technology towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So we'll hear from Claire. We'll then hear from James, who is author of End State, which I hope you've all read, and if not, it's available from all good bookshops, and probably the bad ones as well. And so he's very interested about the relationship between individuals and the state. He's worked for Gordon Brown, he's worked in the Resolution Foundation, and the charity sector, really thinking about economic change and how that affects people's real lives. And then we're going to hear from Jeni Tennison, OBE, you accepted it, who's a founder of Connected by Data, and putting community at the heart of data narratives, practices and policies. She's co-chair of the Data Governance Working Group at the Global Partnership on AI, a Shuttleworth Foundation Fellow, and somebody who it's a lot of fun to be sat next to on a plane, as I can personally vouch for. So we're going to hear from them in that order, and I will try and be at least as reasonable with their timing as with my own. So Claire, can we start with you? And I want to start off with a sort of classic cliche that people always say data is the new oil. And there's lots of interesting comparisons, particularly at the moment, about what we think about oil. How much is that true? And what can we learn from the history of oil and geopolitics to create a better system to manage data?
Thank you, Julian, and thank you, everyone. It's great to be here, and I'm still quite thrilled by being in a real room with a real live, in-person audience. This data is the new oil analogy. It's sort of, there's lots of breathless things that went around. Possibly it might be getting slightly passé now, but a few years ago you couldn't move for articles saying data is the new oil, and it was all so exciting, and it was always sort of said as a really positive, exciting thing, like it's powering the economy, everything's so great. And of course, both data and oil do fantastic, have done and continue to do great things in the economy. We're all grateful to have cars and planes and all the rest of it. Perhaps we need to do it very differently now, but both have led to huge improvements in living standards. But I was kind of intrigued that the analogy was always made so positively, because at the moment, I'm not sure that we want anything really to be the new oil. When you think about, the IPCC report that came out this week, saying the sort of damaging effect that, first of all, the hugely damaging effect that fossil fuels have had on the world, and secondly, the damaging effect that the oil industry has had on the political, on sort of political attempts to deal with it, and the way that lobbying and so on has undermined political action. Similarly, when you think about sanctions against Russia, what are the sectors which are the hardest to sanction, and what are the areas where the politics are most difficult? It's oil, it's fossil fuels. So I don't think that we really want anything to be the new oil. Thank you very much. So this really sort of set me thinking. This analogy, data is the new oil, it's a bit of a, everyone who knows about data there's a million articles that will tell you why data is not the new oil, from various sort of technical reasons about the characteristics of data, the characteristics of oil, and yet there's something about it that kind of refuses to die. It's a bit of a zombie analogy in the way that, it kind of keeps coming up however many times people try to debunk it. So I think there's something there, and that really made me think, well, is there something there to worry about? If there are so many ways in which data does seem to people to be the new oil, what is it that we can learn about oil and think about what not to do in terms of data? And I think the real thing, the critical thing here is the political power that oil companies have, both in terms of their impact on the national politics of individual states and in terms of the impact on geopolitics and the way that oil and the sort of competition for oil and thinking about the security issues around oil have affected relationships between states. Now, I think there's two things here, perhaps, just very briefly to say from the history of oil to really watch out for. The first is concentration. The reason why certain governments, countries that export oil have become so powerful is because oil, unlike data, is geographically concentrated. There are countries that have it and there are countries that don't. And if you have it, you're in a more powerful position in the market than if you don't. Data, of course, is not concentrated. It comes from everywhere. It comes from all of us. And yet, we're kind of a bit behaving as if it is. We're almost constructing, in some ways, a policy environment that runs the risk of allowing data to become concentrated, because we're not challenging this idea of, the fact that if your data is produced on a certain platform, that the owners of that platform own the data. There's a few platforms that massively dominate globally the social media markets, advertising markets, and so on, and they hold most of the data, and we're not really in our policy thinking, challenging the concentration. I think we're running the risk of kind of completely unnecessarily creating a situation where some of our data companies will have a lot of power in the same way as some of our oil exporting countries have, and you can imagine a scenario kind of a few years down the line where a government is coming up for an election and it's desperately trying to negotiate with a social media company about, what is the exact algorithm that they're going to run to regulate the news feed around the election. None of us want to live in that world, but if we allow the concentration of data to run unchecked, then I think there are risks there, and it's not too late. We've seen the Digital Markets Act passed in the European Union last week. I think there are things that we can do about it now. These are policy choices. The second thing, very quickly, is infrastructure. The big oil companies in the US didn't make their money from drilling oil. They made their money from controlling the infrastructure. Rockefeller made his money by controlling the railways, not by controlling the oil wells. And I think infrastructure is something that we don't think about enough when we think about data, particularly in terms of inequalities between countries. There are countries, we're drowning in data here, but in Africa, only just over a quarter of the population is using the internet at all. And these are choices that we're making, again, about infrastructure, and these are public policy areas that something can be done now. We're at the beginning of this journey. Feels like we've been having these conversations for a long time, but it's very, very young. I do think we possibly got the sort of choice now to go on a different course, but I do think we have to think very hard about how to make sure that data is not the new oil if we're going to avoid some of those pitfalls of the past.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And 5 minutes goes very fast. And it's astonishing. We do have a clock
I
here.
know, but I forgot to look at it before I started.
But some really interesting things there about control and about infrastructure and how we do it and how do we stop it being the new oil. I think we'll come back to some of those. But I do want to bring James in. So your book, End State, talks about the Industrial Revolution. So we're going back, perhaps even further. What can we learn from the Industrial Revolution? Are there things that we should learn, or actually is it just an unhelpful analogy and we should really be giving up on that as an approach?
Sure, it's a terrifying clock that is ticking away, so I'll jump straight in. It's a question I'm fascinated by, sort of what is similar and what is not similar between the industrial and the digital revolution. My book, End State, is quite largely based on the idea that there are worthwhile similarities and that the analogy is at least a useful one to think about. So I often give a talk where I kind of run through all the similarities and I make that argument that the two are kind of similar in important ways. The first question that always comes from the audience is someone saying that's nonsense, they're completely different. So last week I actually tried a different talk where I talked about how different the two revolutions were, and the first question from the audience was, that's nonsense, they're both very similar. So I'm going to start by saying there are similarities and differences. So to start with a similarity, I think, and this is sort of quite a deep similarity, is what I call kind of they're kind of formally similar, if that makes sense, the two revolutions. So I think it is true, increasingly clear, that the digital revolution is a sort of what you might call a discontinuity or a break in economic history, in the sense that it's the economy that is emerging from it is sort of qualitatively different from the economy we had before. And that is very similar to the Industrial Revolution, in the sense that the industrial economy was not just sort of bigger or faster or noisier, than the one we had before. It was a different kind of thing. It was just a fundamentally different kind of economy that worked differently at the level of its logic. And it does seem increasingly the case, only really in the last 10 years, I would argue, this has become apparent, that the digital economy works differently at the level of its logic to what were all used to in the 20th century. I do think that's quite useful as an insight, because although it sounds kind of obvious, it's important. It tells us what kind of policy work we need to do in response to that change. So it tells us essentially that we can't be incrementalist. So we're not going to respond to the digital revolution by sort of tweaking the taper rate in universal credit or by tweaking the basic rate of income tax. That's not the kind of response that we need. We need a deeper response that's basically more radical than that, and is about reimagining the institutions of the state and probably coming up with some new institutions, whole new domains of public policy that we haven't thought about before and that will seem quite scary, I suspect, as those start to emerge. I'm very interested, maybe we can pick this up in conversation, about the process by which radical ideas go from seeming radical and impossible to suddenly seeming like common sense over the course of 2 or 3 decades. Obviously that happened a lot in the Industrial Revolution, where big ideas like the welfare state, free education, free healthcare, seemed implausible and unaffordable, and then suddenly became a new common sense. So that's the kind of transition I think we're going to go through now, and that's, I think, in some ways quite similar. A couple of differences very quickly, because the clock is ticking. So one difference I think is a big deal is the information revolution is obviously intangible, and its core material is intangible, is data, is ideas, is information. Whereas the Industrial Revolution was obviously a very tangible revolution. When you read the history from that time, you can almost smell it coming off the page. It's sewage filled the River Thames, children lost their limbs in factories, the railway tracks literally didn't line up, and so people had to change trains when they moved between different gauges of railway tracks. Whereas today, if you think of the big social problems we're facing, they're sort of quite hard to put your finger on. So, mental illness as opposed to physical illnesses like cholera, kind of distrust, populism, burnout as a kind of big problem in the workplace. That's a really different type of set of problems, and I think it's not one we're used to solving in public policy. I call them soft problems as opposed to hard problems, because they're quite hard to kind of get your hands on as a kind of policy maker and a policy thinker. And then the other difference I'm going to point to briefly at the end is another profound difference, which is sort of where are we starting from, which is very different to last time around. So, and this I'm going to simplify a lot here in the interest of time, but in response to the Industrial Revolution, we sort of built from scratch the modern policy, the modern state. That's not to say there was nothing there before, because of course those reformers were having to push back against all kinds of ideologies and sort of vested interests that already existed. But we built the modern state as we know it today, and it didn't exist in the mid-19th century. What we have to do now is a very different thing, which is change an existing state with huge complex systems like the NHS, like the welfare system. We have to reimagine that state into something different. And in some senses, I think changing a state is harder than building one. And that's, I think, quite a fundamental difference in how this will play out politically and in policy terms. So both similar and different in different ways.
Fantastic. So we now need somebody from the audience to say, well, that's rubbish, and it's not both similar and different in different ways. But again, some really interesting things there about tangibility, about changing the state, and I think we'll come back to some of those themes as well. And I'm tempted to talk about the Overton window, but we'll see if that comes up naturally. So we've talked about oil, we've talked about Industrial Revolution. We've slightly touched on the pressures for change when something goes wrong in a scandal. So, Jeni, your essay questions talk about food.
That's
so when we've had food regulation from allergies, ethics, weight-related issues, how can we learn from food towards data? Is data the new carrots or the new whatever?
I'm very glad you asked that question, Julian. I've been looking at the relationship between data and food, because the systems and the way that food has an impact on our lives is quite similar to the way that data has an impact on our lives. So food is fundamental, ubiquitous, we all need it. And obviously we all need data, right? We need our Wi-Fi, otherwise we get very distressed. It's also a very complex and diverse ecosystem when you're providing food. Like, our food chains span the globe. We have diversity in terms of, small coffee shops around the corner versus big international chains. And again, that's very similar when it comes to data. Even the small one-person website will be managing people's data. It's not just the big Googles of this world. And the harms and benefits also fall in similar kinds of ways. They fall to us as individuals, right? We can get food poisoned. We can also have our identity stolen, so very personal kinds of impacts. We can have community impacts. So if you look at the levels of sugar intake amongst the poorest in our societies are higher, and therefore they get more obesity. In the same way, we see particular impacts around the use of data on minoritized communities. And then there are big systemic kinds of things. So our food ecosystem affects our climate in the same way as our data ecosystem affects our climate. So those impacts at all of those different kind of scales seem the same as well. So it's really interesting then to look at how food has been regulated, in particular in the UK, how that system of regulation has turned up, and what lessons we might draw about data. And I could go on for ages, but I'll try and make it very quick. In the early to mid 19th century, there was just an epidemic of adulteration of food. So practically no foodstuff that you could get didn't have some kind of extra material added to it to change its color, to bulk it out. You know, you had chalk in milk, lead in sweets, you had alum in bread, and you had this group of citizen scientists who started looking at how to detect this adulteration, actually understanding how to pull it out. And they studied it and found that no bread had no alum in it. Every single piece of bread that they tested had alum in it, for example. Then in 1858, there was the Bradford lozenge scandal, right, where they meant to adulterate this with powdered gypsum, what was called DAF, to put it into the sugar, but instead accidentally adulterated it with arsenic. And 200 people were poisoned, 21 people died as a result of this. And that kicked off this whole set of legislation that happened in the mid to late 19th century. And there are 5 kind of really interesting pieces that you see in this legislation that kind of carried through to today. They put in place a testing infrastructure, public analysts who could detect adulteration in food and would provide reports. Where are our professionals that audit data systems and AI systems and just give a report about what it does? They put into place incentivization for due diligence up and down the food chain so that the shopkeeper would want to check their supplier to make sure they weren't selling adulterated food. How are we keeping websites liable for the ad tech that they put on their sites? We have a whole history of honest labeling around food, and obviously we have privacy policies in our when it comes to data. But in labeling of food, there's now a focus on harms, like this will make you hyperactive, right? Whereas in our focus on privacy policies, it's all about our rights. You don't see your rights around food, your consumer rights listed on labels. Why is that? There's also a whole thing about enforcement, prisons, and destruction of property when it came to food. What if AI systems were destroyed when they were found to be harmful, rather than giving people leeway to just adjust them? Where are our routine inspections of those that are using data that not only provide assurance, but also provide support to people who are running these systems and help them to increase their capability? And then more recently, we've seen consumer nudges around the consumption of sugar, for example, so sugar tax on sugar in drinks, and also not being able to do 2-for-1 deals with sugary food. And this is really where we start to recognize how the system influences our decisions as individuals, right? We see that when we go to the supermarket, there's chocolate there, you grab it on the way out, and now there's law that stops you from having that in your supermarket. Where are the similar kinds of things that help us to avoid these dark patterns that nudge us into bad behavioral choices as individuals around data? So that's my quick run through. But the kind of lessons that I'm drawing from that are, our data regulation was put in place for a different kind of world, and it's unfit for the complexity, the ubiquitousness, the diversity of our data ecosystem now. We've had 150 years of food legislation. We've got a lot to do quickly when it comes to data. And what's the scandal that triggers change? It's my last point, don't worry, Julian. Where we've had like Cambridge Analytica, we've had the qualification scandal, the mutant algorithms, but there will be another scandal, is whether we'll be ready with our kind of policy choices to respond to that quickly to get the right legislation in place.
Thank you, and thanks to all 3 of you. We are much less behind than I'd expected, which is fantastic. So we're going to have a couple of questions from me as an opportunity for you to think of things that you'd like to talk about, and for those of you online to use the Q&A feature to put questions in. Can I just pick up on a thread that all 3 of you have somewhat touched on in the analogies, which is this thing about tangibility? Because I found myself thinking, it's easy to understand the concept of people being poisoned by arsenic, and it's very easy to understand that's bad and you don't want it to happen to you. One thing that I've found quite shocking is that what look to me like astonishing misuses of data are often just forgotten later. You know, vast amounts of data that get lost to people. You know, there's been any number of scandals, but nobody's noticed. And I think that's a distinction with some of the sort of health problems that you saw in the Industrial Revolution, obviously with oil. Is data just completely different because it's so intangible? Do we have to do more to get people to see the realities of it? Does anybody want to respond to any of what I've said?
I mean, I think it's both tangible and intangible, to take the theme of the evening. I mean, what's interesting is, you know, in my organisation, we work with partner governments around the world. And for some of them, data is extremely tangible, for example, because it's become a subject of discussion in trade deals. So they are, you know, data has become part of diplomacy and part of commercial policy and part of foreign policy. And that is extremely tangible because it's tangible partly in itself, because people are making decisions now that they think are going to affect the prospects for their own businesses, for their own industries, their chance of competing in this industries of the future. It's also tangible because they're being invited by their trading partners to trade data off against other things. You know, okay, you can have this data bit of the trade deal, but we want something else in return. So I think there are ways in which, at least in the sort of geopolitics of data, it's actually surprisingly tangible.
I'll pick up again, and again, I do think that there's a food analogy here, but there's a thing about how individual impact from bad food, you know, if you vomit the next day, then you have it very, very tangibly. And you can see that when you have, as I said, you know, identity theft. That is something that affects people very saliently. But there is lots of the impacts of data and the kind of the way that it works that are impossible for you to even detect as an individual. When you are being given a price that is higher than other people around you, when your search results are changed because you're in a particular kind of filter bubble, when you are shown and misinformation is kind of put at the top of your feed, you can't compare what you are seeing to what other people have seen. So it becomes invisible. And I suppose, you know, the analogy is that some of the food poisoning type issues were also invisible. It took ages for people to realize that a particular contaminant in some beer was what was causing a whole set of people to become ill. Like the link between the contaminant and that was difficult to trace because it's a complex system. So I don't think it's quite so. I think the systemic impacts is what we worry about and that are very difficult for individuals to see, and that's the bit that makes it non-salient.
James?
Yeah, I think this is just a really big deal, the intangibility of the social problems today, because I think if you think about the kind of mechanisms by which that point I made about kind of radical ideas go from seeming completely implausible to being accepted, the mechanism by which that happened in industrial history was often this kind of mounting sense of crisis, very tangible crisis. So the kind of one of my favourite examples is the big stink in London, where you know, sewage literally piled up in the streets, and the Thames, you know, was kind of black, kind of ran black with sewage. And you get these exasperated letters written to the Times newspaper with people saying, "I can't breathe," kind of for the smell in London. And the radical idea that emerged was the idea of a public sewer system, which people dismissed as a kind of dangerous act of government overreach when it was first kind of mooted in the sort of early 19th century. And then it became obvious that something had to happen, and so the kind of politics moved on, because the problem was just so damn tangible that it was just kind of there to see. And I do think that's not happening in the same way now, because so many of these problems are they're very real problems, very serious problems causing real harm, but they've got this intangibility to them of anxiety, stress, burnout, mental ill health, and so they're not kind of they're not in our faces in quite the same way. And I do worry about what that does. Do we get these same moments of kind of something must change here, and do you get that same mechanism where the crisis triggers the change? I do think one final point is kind of representatives played quite an important part historically. So classically, the trades unions who were able to kind of galvanize working people and act as a voice and a force for change and amplify people's voices. And there's just something interesting question for me about who represents, say, data users. Who are the representative bodies that can say, we need this? That they're kind of missing from the debate, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to come back onto some of that. But Claire, did you have something to add?
I mean, just a point on this intangibility, I think is really interesting, and I think that's partly why we're so obsessed with analogies in the data space. You know, is data like oil, is data like land, is data like water, is data like music? And I think that's because partly the intangibility, we sort of don't know how to think about it. So we're constantly looking around for something which we do understand, which is tangible, that we can hook on to this debate and somehow make it meaningful and sort of help us to understand how to think about it. And I think a big part of this problem, and perhaps a link to why we haven't seen any of these sort of strong civil society movements yet around data, is because we don't kind of know how to think about it. I mean, this may be another version of the intangibility issue, but I think it's a sort of intangibility expressed in sort of political models and political activism. How do we think about what data is and our place in it and what we want to happen if we sort of still don't really know what it is, and we keep casting around for these analogies and they're all a bit unsatisfactory, and eventually we have to agree on what data is, not what it's like, I think.
Just building up on that, and I'm assuming you'll stick with the theme of saying, you know, both yes and no to every single question. Do policymakers understand what they're talking about? Do politicians understand what's happening? You know, and what could we do to help them in the broader sense as to understand what the issues are as well as how to tackle them?
I want to come off the fence, so I think
I thought you might.
no, they do not. I say that I think of myself as a policymaker, so kind of we do not. And I think it's partly that point that we reach for pre-existing mental models, concepts, words, and a lot of the most fundamental concepts that we use in public policy no longer work, no longer have purchase. So I was in a very interesting discussion last week, I think it was, about data ownership, where we were kind of debating, can you even own data? Does it make any sense to say I own this data? And a lot of our initial attempt to think about data and regulate data was based on this concept of that's my data, so can I have it please? And that makes absolutely no sense in the context of data, because someone else can have the data and you can still access the data. So I do think that's just a really recurring problem, that we kind of just take these pre-existing, if you like, sort of pre-digital concepts like ownership, a lot of the most fundamental concepts in economics, likewise, sort of no longer really quite work. And we think those words mean the same thing now, and they don't. And I think the policy community is particularly sort of prone to that, of saying things like, you know, Uber drivers, are they employed or are they self-employed? They're kind of neither. They're kind of neither. So let's we try and sort of stuff the mattress back into the box, but it's, you know, we need some new concepts and new ways of thinking about these things. To your point.
Is somebody going to defend policymakers?
Well, I'm not, but I'm going to sort of be slightly further on the fence. I mean, I don't think policymakers understand this stuff, but I think in the sector in which we operate, which is roughly speaking the sort of broadly international development sector, I'm never very happy with that label, but let's stick with it for now. You know, I think part of the problem is, at least in this sector, we're so sort of hooked on the technology and on the technical issues. You know, there's millions of dollars being poured into training people to be data scientists. And not that we don't need more data scientists, absolutely we do, but that is not the solution to getting governments to think more intelligently and regulate more effectively and develop better policy on data. You don't want data scientists, you want policymakers who can know enough to understand what data scientists do and what questions they can ask and answer through data science, but it's a different skill set, how to be an effective policymaker, an effective manager of data science projects in the public sector, an effective policymaker and regulator and lawyer and all of the other skills that you need is different. And I think, at least in the international development sector, there's always this sort of assumption that it's basically a supply-side problem. You just pump more data scientists into the system and everything will and they will sort it out. And I think we're sort of lining up another set of problems for ourselves, because there's a whole sort of set of issues on the demand side. Who's going to be using these data scientists? Who's going to be commissioning the products? Who's going to be thinking about what problems in the public sector we want data science to solve, and how can we organize institutions and systems to make it so. So I don't think policymakers are ready, and I think we're not even thinking about, at least in the international development sector, we're not giving enough thought to even how to get people ready, let alone, actually then supporting people when they're in that position.
Jeni.
I'm going to be a little bit defensive of policymakers, because why not? Well, so if we have the full span. I mean, it's really easy to, in particular, to ridicule politicians, like full stop, but particularly around data and algorithms, where they talk about mutant algorithms, or the idea that we have to get rid of all algorithms, when that is just how we use data. It's not something that you can get rid of. But I think that, A, it's technical, B, it's new, C, it's complex, right? It's and interconnected, it's a systemic kind of, it's built into the systems that we operate in. It's an international problem. It has all of those features that just make it very hard. And I don't think that any of us even, like, outside of, I suppose I can view myself as a wonk and therefore part of the policymaker community as well. But even those of us who are embedded in it can't come up with this is the solution, this is the thing that you should do, because all of those things are just very difficult. So I think we should cut some policymakers a little bit of slack around their ability to respond. I think, James, your point is a bit about how we gradually iterate ourselves there, right? It's about what's the big vision about where we could get to, so that we have at least something to cling on to, and then how do we experiment in a way that is sensitive and that is rational, and that kind of helps us to get to the right kind of solutions, recognizing that we won't know the answers from here and from where we are, but we should be searching for them.
So can we perhaps think a bit about sort of the structures that we need to manage all of this? Because the three areas you've all spoken about all led to a whole set of new organisations, new institutions, new constructions to manage something new. I'm going to assume that you all think that there needs to be some new things. What are they? And how do we get them even remotely right? Who feels like starting? I think Jeni.
I mean, I'm happy to. So one of the big strands of work that we were doing at the Open Data Institute when I was there, and is continuing, is around data institutions and the new kinds of organisations that we need to steward data on behalf of groups and communities and societies. And we already have data institutions that we rely on, so Office of National Statistics, the Met Office, right, Ordnance Survey, they are already these existing data institutions. But there is a huge active field of research around the new types of data institution that we need, ones that are created kind of bottom up with the representatives that you were talking about, James, so that individuals kind of contribute data into an organisation that then chooses how to share it in a kind of collective way. And these kinds of intermediary organisations that can act as the institutional home for data when we see it as a more common good, as a community good, these are the kinds of organisations that we're going to need. They have all the problems that you have with organisations, how are they funded, how are they sustainable, how do they actually get the voice of the community into the stewardship of that data. But this is the strand of research that we really need to push on, I think.
I mean, I think in oil, the sort of pitfall to avoid is apart from governments and companies, which obviously are the preeminent institutions in oil, the specific organisations that came about, the first, perhaps, kind of institution that came about, globally at least, in the oil market was OPEC. It was the producers' organisation. So it was very much the producers getting together to sort of defend their interests, defend their prices. And the institutions that were really trying to sort of reconcile the interests of producers and consumers and communities where the oil was coming from, things like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and others followed a long way later, and when the market was very well developed and very concentrated, and perhaps it was a little bit too late. So I think one of the lessons from the oil sector here is very much wouldn't start from here, and try to make sure that the institutions that are set up are kind of balanced between the different interests. And perhaps the one good example to take from the oil sector, and I'd be interested if there's anyone in the audience who I'm sure knows more about this than I do and may tell me why it's not a good example, is the trust fund that the Norwegian government set up to try to manage the revenues from oil and make sure that they were used, that they were sort of stewarded over the long term, and that they were used to benefit the society over the long term. And I think that is the one example perhaps that you can point to from the oil sector in trying to reconcile the kind of producing and the different interests at play, and think about kind of what you want over the longer term rather than just thinking about the kind of immediate market interests, which has been the history of institutions in the oil sector. I think there's a lot of lessons there of what to not do.
James.
So yeah, definitely agree. There's a whole tranche of sort of missing institutional architecture, I guess, in data in particular. The two other points I'd add is there's a whole bunch of institutions that are sort of misclassified because things have changed under our feet. So the example would be the big platforms, so Facebook, Google, Amazon to some degree, which are legally speaking just private companies. They're kind of they're sort of classified as the same as a small shop in America, kind of, and they're within the same legal regime essentially. And the idea that that's an appropriate legal regime for these globally significant infrastructure platforms is just madness. And so you see them making these decisions and having this power that no private company should have. So who can speak and who can't speak? Banning Trump, however you may agree or disagree with that as an individual decision. How can a private company have the power to decide this person can't speak now in our main sort of public forum? So I think that's a good example. They're just misclassified, and we need to come up with a new classification, a new sort of concept for what they are. It's a new thing that we haven't had before. We'll need to give it a name, and it will need to come with new responsibilities and new kind of requirements and new governance, new controls. The other point I'd make is we need to quite fundamentally reform some of the kind of core institutions of the state. So the most obvious being the big Whitehall department, which is it looks more antiquated by the year as a kind of these kind of big hierarchical, bureaucratic, relatively siloed organizations which look nothing like the kind of economy that they're increasingly having to govern. They look like a sort of mid-1950s corporation, really, in the way that they function. And so there's something about just quite fundamentally reimagining what the state looks like so that it can be more agile, more iterative. The policy-making process is very slow. It's kind of, we don't quite write the law in vellum anymore, but nearly. And we might as well for how long it takes to pass a new law and then change it. So there's something about just kind of making the state much more kind of able to adapt quickly and try things out and experiment.
Can I step even bigger than the state and think about the global nature of some of this? Because my understanding of the history of food regulation, industrial revolution, obviously, was that it happened in a very patchwork way around the world. Some places did their own thing in completely different ways, and still now we have that. Whereas oil was more global, I think, from fairly early on. Correct me if I'm wrong. What do we need to think about with data, and should we aim for one set of global rules? I mean, is it possible that there will be agreement between the US, the European Union, and China? You may want to talk about Russia and some of the questions that have come up over the last month or so about its control of data and use of data for military or geopolitical spaces. What do we think about when we think about all of these problems from a global perspective?
I mean, I think this is where I'm sort of very finely balanced between optimism and pessimism. I think there's a lot of it, there's a lot of sort of multilateralism about that's happened, or there's a lot of kind of things with a global significance that are happening. There are national or regional policies, like everything the European Union does has a global significance because of the way in which, you know, these companies are global, and so what looks like national policy actually is global. You know, and that's, you know, that is probably one of the kind of best ones which is out there, but it can also, if you're making policy from a global perspective from a national perspective that has global implications, you know, you're going to exclude companies that can't meet the requirements if that's not sort of what was in your mind to start with. So there are unforeseen consequences. So there are sort of national policies that have a global impact. Then there are national policies which are deliberately designed to have a global impact, like trade policy, like, you know, government, like the sort of trade stance that companies are taking in WTO negotiations, and some of the aid and investment policies of countries, you know, most famously China, but they're not really alone in sort of trying to actively influence other countries' data policies through different kinds of global relationships, but from a national interest standpoint. There are sort of slight kind of coalitions of the willing that haven't really sort of quite got going. So the Japanese government tried to start something in the G20 about data flow free with trust, and sort of trying to have it both ways on freedom, but also some protections. It didn't quite get the sort of required level of traction to really start to influence some of those more sort of regulatory bodies. But there have been attempts at those kind of multilateralism through coalitions of the willing. There are lots of activity on this at the UN in different places. The UN Secretary General has really made this quite a key part of his platform for his, what's now at the sort of very beginning of his second term, and really does think that the UN has a role to play here. You know, if it can't kind of think about something like this, which is such a sort of obviously global issue, then kind of what's it for? Again, I think, you know, with varying levels of success. So I think the sort of bare bones of a global process, you know, we might look back in 20 years and go, oh, that was the beginning of that good stuff that happened. Or we might look back in 20 years and say, you know, what were they thinking that they could solve the problem that way? Because then these awful other things happened, and obviously that was never going to work. And I wouldn't put a bet either way at this point.
I mean, let's meet back here in 20 years' time. Who wants to go?
Yeah, happy to. So I work with the Global Partnership on AI, which is supposed to be a global body. In fact, is just a set of about 18 of those kinds of countries that happen to get together and have some commonality. So it's good to see those kinds of alliances kind of taking place in order to get to some level of some subset of global norms. I think the thing that I keep coming back to, though, is that data and its impact and digital and its impact do have different impacts in different places, and our norms are different in different kinds of places. So I'm doing some work at the moment with Research ICT Africa, looking specifically at how to bring an African voice into the debates that we have around, at a global level, around AI ethics, data ethics, and data governance, and what that should look like, which are partly informed by the different kind of, you know, the blind spots that we have around the impacts of data, just because we function in the global north in particular ways. And are partly informed by the kind of traditional decision-making structures that you find in Africa. So the Ubuntu tradition, which is much more collective in its thinking, for example. And so I think that there is definitely work to do at an international level around standards, around having institutions that are stewarding data even at that international level as well. But I do think we need to leave quite a lot of room for some differences when it comes to data governance and digital governance, just because the context makes such a difference to how we view the use of those kinds of technologies, and it is different in different localities.
James?
I thought I was an optimist on on the global aspects of this. I had, in an early draft of my book, I had a chapter on this kind of question of the sort of global institutional architecture, I guess you'd call it, and my editor says it was too depressing. So I took it out. So it obviously wasn't quite as optimistic as I thought. The reasons I thought it was optimistic, partly the point you make, Claire, about single blocks, as long as they're powerful enough, can have a kind of, can essentially set global regulations, in the sense that the EU or the US are sufficiently significant markets that if they do lean into some of these debates around privacy and so on, then the big tech platforms sort of just end up adopting that as their kind of global, or adopting that globally, subject to, other than certain regions where we now have separate internets essentially sort of breaking off. But so that kind of makes me feel quite optimistic that we can sort of make progress even without a consensus internationally. I also think civil society is there are some very interesting examples in the last couple of years. So things like Our World in Data that people might know about, which was it's just a fantastic civil society initiative that just puts amazing live data out there and was obviously very powerful in the pandemic, putting data in people's hands around what was happening globally on the pandemic. And that's basically just a sort of civil society initiative, not working through governments. So there's a sort of emerging global civil society in the tech for good space, I guess you might call that. So I kind of, I thought that was an optimistic take. Maybe it wasn't quite optimistic enough for the book. And I guess I do think we've got a long way to run. We've got a long way to run in the when it comes to global institutions.
So we've had a number of questions from me, but we're now going to take questions from you in the audience, and we've got a few who have already come in online. If you have a question here, could you put your hand up, and I'll try to get one of our wonderful mic runners over to you. So if we start off with just up there.
Yes, just to drive home this idea of how not intransigent, I've lost the word, of data, how difficult, how intangible data is, that's the one. It may be a bit naive to think of data as the content of databases, as being names and addresses and this sort of thing. With the advent of AI systems, AI algorithms are looking at patterns of data, and what's more, those patterns of data might be transient. And so the regulation may need to be in the moderation of how the AI systems are responding to transient patterns of data. And the thinking has to be far beyond that of...
Could you make this a question that we can answer?
No, it was an observation. Well, I mean, are the policymakers thinking far enough ahead?
How do we think about...
In terms of what data actually is?
Yeah, I think that, I think you're right about that. There's been a tradition of thinking about data, as you say, in this quite kind of static way that has been really it's transformed over the past 20 years. So, you've got so many more sensors, satellite imagery, so much more digital kind of streams, and the way that it's used in the kind of big data algorithms just means that we are, as you were saying, pulling out patterns instead of just making decisions on like one individual record. And that does change how we need to think about how we regulate it. So it means that we get linked to other people who are like us in databases. We're not just judged based on our own information. We're judged based on our links with other people. Data becomes relational. It becomes something that is collective. And our regulation doesn't doesn't handle that at all. We don't have regulation that is focusing on the harms that can come from, or the impacts, whether they're beneficial or harmful, that can come from the use of algorithms, AI systems, the use of data. We still are focusing on its collection and how it gets processed, not on the outputs, which is, when you've got these big complex systems, is what we really need to focus on. So.
We don't all have to answer every question.
I want to hear the next question.
So the next question I think was just in front over there. Are there any over here? I'll do the ones online. Yeah.
Thanks so much. There's a really interesting example that you've probably come across, the Times defending people throwing sewage out of the window in Victorian Britain, saying it's a gentleman's right. This sort of spots some of the things you've been talking about today, and I wonder if the resistance to how we deal with negative externalities, particularly around government sort of tending into nanny statism, how much that there's a similarity between the Industrial Revolution or any other sort of particular part of history that you're a specialist in, and today with the digital revolution.
James, you want to start us off on this one?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating here when you see the arguments made. I find it actually makes me very optimistic when you look back at the arguments made against things like banning child labour, where people said it would be kind of a catastrophe for British manufacturing. And always the argument is government overreach, is kind of just a repeated argument, a repeated refrain of public sewers, as I said, were seen to be this kind of a thin end of the wedge kind of argument. And similarly with with the NHS and with free education, for example, there's always this argument of kind of where will this go next, and this kind of fear of the state meddling in our lives. And it also takes, one thing that's fascinating is just how long it can take for seemingly obvious problems to be solved. So the other example I love is the gauge wars, which were this kind of crazy period in history that, for those who don't know, where in the kind of railway boom in Britain, the two great engineers at the time, Brunel and Stephenson, had different views about how far apart the railway tracks should be laid. One of them laid them wide and one laid them narrow. And of course, they both set to laying lots of railway tracks. And so wherever their tracks met, they didn't link up. And so you had to literally stop one train, and every passenger had to get off that train and onto a wide gauge train and then kind of re-embark. And it took something like 60 years for the gauge wars to fully come to an end. And even after the government said there must be one standard gauge for railway tracks, there was a loophole, and they got to still build in the west of England different gauge tracks. And so eventually they had to actually physically, once they did enforce the standard gauge, they had to physically lift on all the wide gauge tracks. They had to physically move one track closer to the other so that it would work on the standard gauge. And then finally trains could pass between these two separate systems. So I guess the point there is just kind of, it can take a long time for things that now seem to us completely obvious. And at the time, MPs, very smart people, stood up in Parliament and argued for why this was a kind of outrageous infringement on our liberty to enforce a single standard gauge for railway tracks. So I think we should be used to some of this we should expect some of this to take quite a lot of time, but I feel very confident that there's a certain insistence to the process that it will happen in the end.
Some of us still remember having to change trains at Royston because there was not. I see some people remember this. There was not a direct train to Cambridge. You had to all get out and get back on again. Claire,
I wonder if there is also, and I'm just thinking about this as I'm talking, so it may not bear examination, but I wonder if there's also an analogy with sort of periods with perhaps the creation of the NHS and a moment when a market actually changed quite quickly. That there was a market for healthcare in this country in a particular way that, we thought of the role of doctors in society and the sort of economic relationship between doctors and patients and where that set in. And then, it was changed really relatively quickly. And doctors, as we know, fiercely opposed the creation of the NHS, and it was felt that this was a kind of gross infringement of people's right to run a business effectively in the way that they wanted to, and that changed quite quickly. And obviously, I don't think it's going to happen in the same way. But just thinking about what you were saying, James, about these big platform companies being kind of a different kind of beast, that we use the same rules to govern the market in platforms as we do to govern the market in in corner shops, and maybe something like the creation of the NHS, a moment when actually government just said, no, we're going to do it like this now, and lots of people shouted and screamed, but it happened, and I think it's worked out okay. And, you know, that could also be an interesting analogy, I think.
And it's fascinating. It's fascinating. I think that the thing that is certain is that in 2050, things will be the case in public policy that we today find unimaginable and would laugh at. And so, and those ideas, because it takes a long time, those ideas will be here today. So there will be ideas out there in the world today which seem completely radical to us and unaffordable, and that by 2050 will be the new common sense. So you can do a kind of, you can kind of go looking. That's kind of what I do in my book, is you can go looking for what those ideas might be. And it's fascinating because they'll be out there. So, I mean, one candidate is something like the 4-day week, which I think is kind of emerging before our eyes as something that is becoming a bit of a new norm and is gathering momentum that currently seems a bit out there. And I would imagine by 2050 that will seem completely normal. And there'll be others out there, which I just think is a fascinating kind of time to be alive and to watch that play out.
So it's interesting to think about these different analogies. The NHS is a fascinating one, though, of course, GPs are still largely private businesses.
Good point.
Still haven't quite made
but
it
in
there.
a very different kind of market. Which is the point,
absolutely.
really.
Discuss. But can I move us on to a question from online, from Louise Bartolo, who talks about when it comes to collective harms of AI systems, one of the regulation analogies is from the environmental sector, with issues designed to deal with longer-term distributed cumulative harms. There's already been a bit of comment about this, particularly, I think, from Jeni. But Louisa's really curious to hear more about how food regulation, for example, could help us deal with some of these long-term collective or societal harms.
Yeah, I hear that analogy with kind of climate action quite a lot, which always makes me very depressed because, of course, we're not doing very well on climate. So, hence, like looking at other kinds of areas, I think is quite interesting. So, yeah, I think that the kinds of things that I went through earlier around the way that food is regulated does give us some hope for addressing some of those more collective harms. If you look in particular at the more recent kind of ways in which harms from food are being addressed, particularly around obesity and sugar, which I mentioned, but also around their climate impact, you're starting to see the use of these behavioural kind of nudges, because there's a recognition that we do all want to be in control of the food that we eat, right? But actually it's shaped by the market, the offer, the way in which food is presented to us will influence what we choose to eat. And so having things like the levies on sugary drinks, having things like things that discourage shops from presenting options that we actually need to discourage as a society, those are things that I think we can learn from moderately quickly in the data arena. Recognizing that the choice architectures that we're presented with as individuals are things that we can choose to shape in different ways in order to get to a different collective kind of impact, I think is really promising.
Okay.
I would go a little bit further because I don't think it's all about simply the choice architecture. I think that's been one of the problems with the approach, you know, not so much now, but perhaps in sort of 10, 15 years ago on climate, that it was all about individual choice.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, you know, just turn your lights off, turn your thermostat down and everything will be fine. And actually, these are kind of system-wide issues. Similarly with food, there's a whole system out there of commercial agriculture which goes beyond what any individual can do with choice. I think the same applies with data. There are things that we can do by not accepting cookies and all of those things, but actually, I think we need to think at both levels. I think that's true of climate, and it's true of food, I think it's true of data.
So I completely agree that it's not at the individual level, which is why the choice architecture is the thing that's important, because it's the how the choices are set up for us as individuals, recognizing that we're swayed in all kinds of ways and don't make sensible choices in these contexts. So how we get more collective control over that choice architecture is the point I was making.
And there's an interesting question about who's pushing for what framings. I mean, the idea of carbon footprints was very much pushed by the fossil fuel industry, because if you think it's your fault for not turning your charger off, it's not their fault. Right.
Exactly.
James, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, the other reason the food analogy is a good one, I think, is the kind of addiction, the incentive on these firms to make their services addictive and to create this kind of... and I think this is one of those really big sort of world-changing issues that that is very because particularly the social media platforms are entirely incentivized to acquire more and more of our attention, and so they are addictive. I mean, that is the whole thing they're trying to do, is to make their services more and more addictive and hard to tear ourselves away from, so that we spend ever more of our time with them and give them ever more of our data, and that's, I think you can't deny that. And so they're trying to create addiction. And as you say, we can't deal with that kind of systemic level addiction on an individual basis. Any of us who's tried to sort of don't have the phone in the bedroom, kind of don't have the phone at the table, and suddenly 2 days later you've got the phone in the bedroom. It's close to impossible to sort of make an individual level intervention to stop these kinds of addictions, and it creeps back up. So we're going to have some kind of systems level intervention to stop that, I think.
There's a question at the back over here.
Thank you for the talk. And since we're talking about analogies, there's one that's been circling my head that might well have been mentioned before, because I missed the initial bit of the talk. But this one really touches on a bit of a darker side of governing in digital future. That is the rise of social surveys. To me, it is a very close analogy to a lot of the element of data and the more dangerous element we're facing now, because since the 1850s, since the onset of massive social surveys in Britain and then its exporting into the colonies around the world, it's the beginning essentially of governing by categorizing people, and it's by stratifying people, and whilst it didn't really wreak havoc on a massive scale in Britain, it did contribute to genocide and ethnic cleansing in Europe and beyond. And I think that's a darker side of governing. And I think, interestingly, because in terms of food adulteration, it doesn't really give the government massive power to do things to its population, whereas data now can. It is a tool inside of the hands of those who govern.
Can we make this a question that we can answer?
Yes, I'm going to get to a question very soon.
Very soon.
Yeah. So, in terms of now the massive expanded tool range that's available to the governors, can you comment on briefly the dangers of governing in the age of digital future?
Claire.
Thank you. I mean, I think this is such an important question. You know, in the work that we do with governments on governance of data, and, you know, the question of sort of inclusivity, agency, the relationship between people and data, this comes up again and again. And what we find is that you get two kind of equal and opposite problems. You get people who are included in data in a way which, as you suggest, can, you know, means that a government which has a sort of malicious intent can identify them, can discriminate against them, can do all kinds of terrible things. There are also other groups who are campaigning fiercely to be included in data. Disability campaigners, campaigners from some ethnic minorities and so on, because they feel it's absolutely critical that their particular that their particular sort of needs, that they're visible in the data, so that the fact that they are discriminated against, for example, or that they have worse health outcomes than average, or that they are poorer or whatever, can be made visible to policymakers. So I think I wouldn't quite share your analysis that this is necessarily a bad thing. It can be a bad thing. It can be an absolutely necessary thing. And I think the difference is kind of good and bad governments, essentially, and that's a problem that data can't really solve. That's about democracy.
Yeah,
James.
Yeah, I was going to say that word democracy, because I think it's sort of a question of power and who decides ultimately. And I think it feels increasingly clear that we don't want, you know, if you have a purely kind of profit motive driven incentive structure around these very large platforms, then you get the addiction economy and you get them incentivized to kind of suck us ever deeper in. On the other hand, do you want government? You know, would it be better than having Mark Zuckerberg running Facebook to have the government running Facebook and having access to that data and that power? So it's kind of, you know, who would you trust, or kind of what mechanisms for legitimacy or democratic mechanisms would you trust with the kind of power that these platforms have? And I don't think that's going to be a new kind of thing. We've never created that kind of thing before, because we've never had this kind of power before. But we will have to find some way to kind of govern these things that feels legitimate and that feels democratic, as you say, that isn't either one end of that spectrum of the kind of, it's just a private company, or it's just the state running this thing, and something new will emerge there, I suspect.
I feel the phrase tyranny of the majority coming on, but Jeni, is open data a good thing?
I was just going to just make one point around this question around data. We tend to talk about data as if it's something that kind of falls from the sky, as if it's a natural phenomenon that we're just, and the oil analogy doesn't help with this, right? It's something that you just suck up from the ground and it's just there. But it isn't, it's designed, to your point, right? The categories and the structures that we decide to use as a society then shape how we think about people, about everything, right? And so they become really important. And I think that that's how we design, precisely to your point, how do we bring communities into that design? Some of the things that I find most hopeful are the work that I've seen from Indigenous communities, from Gypsy and Traveller communities, who are collecting data about themselves to represent themselves as they see themselves. And that, bringing that into the data mix is what I think we need in order to get a fuller picture and in order to avoid some of these harms.
So the countdown timer of doom has turned red now. We've got a few minutes left. I'd like to try and fit in another couple of questions, if there are any burning ones here. But just before I take, well, that will be the last one from here. But just before that, question from Anshuman Iyengar from Innovate UK. So, you know, a funder who, you know, expanding on platform domination, data concentration. Would data be the new oil in the metaverse? And would regulations meant for the bricks and mortar world be valid for the virtual world at all in the future? Quick answers.
I doubt it.
I doubt it, right. Anyone want to get more on the fence than that? Or?
I mean, this is the thing that makes your blood run cold, is the metaverse. Where does that end? And I know there's a lot of skepticism, kind of, because it looks pretty naff, frankly, at the moment. But the logic is there. That is where we're headed. We're headed to far greater use of augmented reality, virtual reality, more immersive. Us spending more of our time immersed in these platforms, and that's kind of one of the things that makes me think something will have to change. Like this is going to get a lot worse if we don't change something quite fundamental.
So virtual food doesn't work very well.
I mean, and what happens in that virtual environment is that every single thing that you do is monitored. It becomes a data stream that connects us again to each other. So I think it's more that all of the issues that we've been talking about here are just magnified.
So we'll have the question here, briefly, I hope.
All right, yeah, hello, thanks for the talk. Coming back to the question previously discussed on whether policymakers actually understand what data is. During the discussion, I saw that, very naively, that data scientists were more or less treated as tools or objects, but surely I think they have minds of their own, optimistically, if we assume that. Basically my question would be, do you think data scientists understand what data is, what their implications are? And, do you think they need to know this? Or do you think if that, are they just treated as tools? Or do you think they should be implicated in the, creation of the policies?
Okay.
And if so, what are the dangers of that?
Quick answers. Do data scientists have minds of their own? Should they be involved?
Yes, they do have minds of their own. I think the analogy or the place to look is how statisticians have the kind of rules around how they need to do their job, and we need similar kinds of things for data scientists. They're not exempt from those kinds of issues. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, we can't expect, in a complicated system, you can't expect any person to know everything. So, I expect doctors to know their job, but that doesn't mean that I think we only need doctors to run the health service. In a similar way, doctors have ethics, they have all kinds of things, but you still need more than that. And I think that's however brilliant data scientists are, and they are brilliant, and I certainly didn't mean to malign them, that can't be all, you can't only have data scientists to run a good data system.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think we're all sort of quite small boats on a very choppy sea, if that makes sense as a metaphor. And there's only so much we can achieve, however much we individually understand this stuff, understand data, and do our best. I think it's got to be a sort of systems level, institution level conversation.
We have a few seconds left for one quick fire question. We've talked about lessons from history. What about lessons from fiction? Which books or similar fictional ideas give you inspiration, positive or negative?
Can I squeeze in one recommendation? So science fiction, genuinely, I think, is fascinating and can spark thoughts. There's a great book called Too Like the Lightning, which is the first of a trilogy, I think. Fascinating. It's a kind of distant future sci-fi novel, which gave me a lot of thoughts.
I was going to borrow from James's Industrial Revolution analogy and think about those sort of, North and South and Middlemarch and some of those fantastic novels about trying to reconcile kind of old and new and the social pressures of the new economy being and the sort of values of the old economy and how these things can be reconciled.
Jeni.
And I will point to a series of things that have been led at the ODI by Millie Zimmerter, who's the head of policy there, who split them up into attention on Asimov, Ursula Le Guin and Octavia Butler as different kinds of ways into and different approaches to the questions around data.
Fantastic. Well, thanks to all three of you. It's been really wonderful to have you with us to talk so fluently and fluidly about so many of these issues and the analogies. Thanks to the attendees here in person and online. Thanks to the university and the Cambridge Festival. And it's been really great to work with the Bennett Institute on Public Policy again. So please do try and stay in touch with all the news and research from the Bennett Institute. Look on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, I presume. And, of course, the new shiny website, bennettinstitute.cam.ac.uk. Thank you all very much. Have a good evening.